Hi, my name is Sheeva Azma. I am founder of science communications company Fancy Comma LLC, and we're a company with a dual mission. Obviously, our main job that we started when I started Fancy Comma in 2020, my goal was to be able to serve people, companies, industry, nonprofit, academia, etc., by communicating science in the form of things like white papers, blog posts, social media, messages, posts, etc. And I did a lot of communicating in the pandemic, and I wrote a whole book on it actually. It's Science X Marketing. I like to say that it's part memoir, part textbook, because I've been an educator for about 20 years. And when I started the Fancy Comma blog and the Fancy Comma YouTube, I had this goal of teaching people what I had learned from 10 years outside of science. So I got my bachelor's from MIT in brain and cognitive sciences, and then I got my master's in my PhD program at Georgetown University in the interdisciplinary program in neuroscience. And I really, in creating this curriculum, I feel that I have lived up to my program at Georgetown by creating a truly interdisciplinary science communication curriculum that unites many different disciplines. It talks about marketing, it talks about journalism, it talks about obviously communication, policy, and I think that's what makes it very powerful is this interdisciplinary nature, bringing together ideas that didn't exist together before, and the interdisciplinary nature, I think, makes this a very easily accessible curriculum because we've all heard about marketing and policy. We may not have heard about like specific concepts in science, but this curriculum is meant to be an add-on for any science course, from high school to college to graduate school to community college. So I wanted to highlight two modules in this. It's a 12-week course. It's a 12 lecture course. There's also 12 homeworks, one homework associated with each module. So there's 12 modules. There's one associated with each module. And they discuss these different topics, as I mentioned. How does this relate to civic science? This course is called Using Science to Solve Hard Problems. And that's pretty much the foundation of civic science, is using science to solve hard problems. In this case, it's using science communication to kind of bridge the gap between science and society. And that's something that we really are where we are putting all of our efforts as a science communication company, is like bridging this gap. So I wanted to highlight two modules and talk a little bit about how I created them and the logic behind the activities I picked and what I used and what I learned. So for week 2, we have a module called Science Happens in the Context of Society. And the goal of this is to talk about a concept called actually a whole field called sociology of science. And how did I learn about sociology of science? Well, at Fancy Comma, we're really lucky because Kelly Tabbitt, who works at Fancy Comma, is actually a PhD sociologist. She's a professor of sociology at Oberlin College. And so she was the one that approached me and was telling me about sociology of science. And a sociology of science, in a nutshell, is basically the social structure of science, the idea that science is a human activity performed by humans for humans, which goes back to this idea of civic science, doing science to help humanity. So, but few people in science talk about it. Maybe now more people talk about it now that Alondra Nelson and Francis Collins were in OSTP, which is the White House Science Advisory. We actually were talking about sociology of science before they were appointed to replace Eric Lander, but it's a really interesting discussion, and one that's actually been going on for about 20 years at the National Science Foundation, I recently learned, but kind of it's a very fragmented discussion because there are no conferences for sociology of science, as they said in the AAAS meeting this past February, which I attended remotely. So that's why I created this module. And the content that we created, as I mentioned, so Kelly is a sociologist, so she created a lot of the content. We actually wrote a blog together. We also talk about sociology of science in week 5, discussing sociology of science as its own separate field. But in week 2, we just talk about this idea that science happens in the context of society, and what does that mean, and why is that important? And so the activity we have is writing a short essay about, there's two choices. You can think about an invention and talk about how it's made your life easier, how it's made your life harder. Has it solved problems? Has it created new problems? Or the other option is to think about advances in your scientific field over the past few years. What are those advances? Have they made your life easier, more difficult? In what ways? And sort of this assignment comes from, actually doesn't come from my scientific experience at all. It comes from my experience as a writing tutor, as a educator, and sort of getting students to think about things in a way that are both grounded in the real world, but are also not too difficult to comprehend. Like sometimes, as I've learned, especially in the communications, right, figuring out what you want to say can be a huge challenge. So if you can make the process of getting to that point where people can practice their communication skills without sort of intimidating students, then that helps a lot. And so communicating about anything, like whether it's about how smartphones have made your life more complicated and or easier, or ways that PCR has made your life easier or more complicated. I mean, and for me, I was an MRI researcher, cognitive neuroscientist. So, I mean, in what ways has learning about the cognitive neuroscience of the brain made my life easier? Well, many. How has it made my life harder? Also, there's a lot to say there, not going to lie. So that's week 2. And the estimated time for that short essay is about an hour. I don't expect much from the students, and the way I grade these is I don't actually grade them. I just review them, and if they look like they are good, which they have been exceptional, I should say. My students have been amazing. So very engaged. We started out with 20 students in the class, and I kind of just, after I created the curriculum in January, I put out a call on our LinkedIn like, hey, does anyone want to be in this class that I'm going to do based on our curriculum? And 19 people responded. We're on week 8 so far, and we have 10 people very engaged in the course, doing the assignments every week, participating in discussions, because we have a 30-minute lecture, up to 30 minutes. Then we have a discussion. Sometimes it's a 5-minute discussion. Sometimes it's a 30-minute discussion. And then we have the homework. So all in all, I would say it's probably like no more than 3 hours of work per week, which is still a substantive amount of work. It's definitely like a long-term time commitment from February of 2024 to July of 2024, but it's definitely not as much of a time commitment as science. It's meant to just be an add-on. It's not meant to give students a PhD in writing or communications or anything. I think that would be really daunting. And I think it's not necessary for the goal of this course, which the name of this course is Communicating Science to Solve Tough Challenges. It's a course meant to impart certain skills. It is not a course to where you learn things just to know them. So that was week 2. Now let's talk about week 8, because I have a science policy background and I'm really excited about science policy, and having worked in the House of Representatives, I learned a lot, both working there and also visiting there for Capitol Hill days in grad school. I worked there as an intern, and there were no other scientists in my office, and as an intern, you're the lowest rung on the totem pole. So my job actually included like summarizing science for them and writing briefings for them and going to different briefings and writing memos for them. So I learned a lot about communication working in Congress, and so I hope to share some of that in week 8. How did I create content for this? It's from my own experience. A lot of it's from my own experience working in Congress, and then after I worked in Congress, I wrote white papers to be read by Congress. I helped elect 2 senators. I am a voracious student of science policy. I attended, as I mentioned, I attended the AAAS conference, and they had as a journalist, I had a press pass since I'm a member of the National Association for Science Writers. So I've been blogging about science policy. I attended as many of the science policy sessions as I could. And so that kind of informed my lecture as well for week 8. And it's really important that the resources I used were primarily Fancy Commas blogs derived from these different places, like kind of going to different talks and then like writing about them and reflecting on them, watching politicians communicate, watching scientists communicate. You can learn a lot just from watching people communicate. And what I learned, actually, I learned a lot. I learned that scientists and policymakers communicate in two completely different ways. So that's really important for scientists to know, so that scientists can be on the same level as policymakers. So that's kind of the impetus and the goals of week 8. And the assignment for week 8 is basically being a communications officer, I guess you could say, for a political candidate. So in 2022, I did field organizing, phone canvassing for Senator Mark Kelly, and I also did help write tweets for Senator Mark Kelly, and we'd come up with communication. Same for Senator John Fetterman, and so I kind of brought some of that to this assignment. Like, put yourself in the shoes of like a communications director for a political campaign. What, for a pro-science candidate, what are the talking points you're going to say that involve science? Because, you know, most policymakers are not scientists, and they deal with many, many science issues. And it's really important that they're able to communicate about those effectively. For the students that are more advanced, they can try writing a one-pager for Congress. We've written a blog about one-pagers. You can even write a white paper summarizing a science topic for a policy audience. Those are kind of outside of the scope of our little kind of experimental science communications course, but those opportunities are there for more advanced people that are really interested in science policy. I know there's a lot of people interested in science policy, but it seems like there's not enough resources and centralized places for science policy enthusiasts such as myself. Same with sociology of science. And that's why I hope that this course kind of creates, maybe fulfills some of that demand that exists for scientists that are wondering, what's the relevance of my work to the real world in realms such as policy, or in realms such as even just reflecting on science as an institution. So yeah, so that's the course. There's actually 10 other modules. I encourage you to check out our website where we have the free curriculum posted. Take the time to peruse the week by week assignments, the videos, background reading, everything. It's there. It's available for anyone to use. And if you do use it, I'd love to hear from you about, you can make it your own, you can adapt it, or you can just use some of the content just straight from the website. It's free, it's open to everyone. And we made it free and open to everyone with the goal of advancing civic science by helping bridge the gap between science and society, to help scientists, as I mentioned, be better able to communicate science to solve tough challenges, of which there's tons of tough challenges happening that involve science these days. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'd love to chat with you if you're an educator in the science communication space, especially if you are teaching people about science communication from a lens of sociology or policymaking. I feel that we need a lot more of that, especially since the policy makers are the people that fund science. So we've got to be able to communicate with them on their level, on their terms, know how they communicate, and be able to communicate effectively with them, as well as introspect on the culture of science so that we can be more effective as an establishment. So I thank you for your time.